All right, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the general pathways that we get these senses, these sensory stimuli to the brain. Okay, and traditionally we talked about that there are three neurons involved in the circuits of getting sensory information from a receptor to the brain. Okay, some books like your textbook, Mary of Hope. Okay, and I remember Saladin's book did this as well, talks about, that there are four neurons involved in this, okay? I'm going to go by what your book is saying and talk about, four neurons within this pathway, okay? So typically the classical pathway for this, like I said, involves, only, three or four neurons, again, depending on who's talking about this, all right? And I kind of diagrammed this out here, okay? So remember, we've been talking about receptors in previous videos, all right? And, I mentioned that receptors, again, are transducers, okay? So when a stimulus, when a stimulus disrupts the receptor potential enough to where it's going to generate a gradient and then an action potential, all right, it's going to start sending action potentials to the central nervous system, okay? So basically the receptor is some form of a cell body, and then projecting from that receptor is an axon going to the spinal cord, okay, or the brainstem, depending on where this receptor is we're talking about, okay? So basically from, I'm just going to use this example, from a receptor to the spinal cord, that's what we would call the first order neuron, okay? So basically this is the first neuron, this is the first nerve cell that is involved in this pathway of getting sensory input to the brain, all right? And then what happens, this first order neuron is then going to synapse with what's called a relay nucleus. Okay, remember a nucleus is just a cluster of nerve cell bodies found within the central nervous system. Okay, and basically the types of cells we're talking about within this relay nucleus are interneurons. Okay, remember we said that interneurons are like the relays of the central nervous system. Okay, so what's going to receive, information, let's say this is a thermoreceptor, okay? I put my hand on this table and I feel it's cold. Okay, so I'm going to, my thermoreceptors are going to generate action potentials, okay, to the relay, to the appropriate relay nucleus of the spinal cord, okay? Depending on the area of the body and depending on what we're talking about, okay? Because for example, sensory input from my hand is going to come up and enter higher into the spinal cord. Okay, sensory input from my legs are going to enter lower in the spinal cord. Okay, but either way, they're still going to synapse with these relay nuclei. All right, and then next, what's going to happen is this interneuron is going to start generating action potentials up towards the brain. Okay, it's going to pass through the brain stem on its way to an area called the thalamus. Okay, now before I talk a little bit about the thalamus, I just want you to note that these interneurons at some point in time are going to cross over from one side of the spinal cord or the brainstem to the other. Okay, so most of the neurons are going to cross over within the spinal cord at some point in time. Some of them are going to do it in the brainstem. So what I'm saying here is if I'm touching this table with my right hand, I'm feeling that this tabletop is cold, okay? Since this interneuron is going to cross over to the left side of the spinal cord and it's going to go up to the left hemisphere of my cerebrum, okay, that means the left side of my brain is going to be receiving this information. That's why when people have strokes, okay, you see the effects, if I have a stroke on the left side of my brain, I'm going to see the effects on the right side of my body because of these sensory and motor neurons and how they cross over within the brainstem and spinal cord. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right, so now this neuron is going to pass up through the brainstem and it's going to hit the thalamus. Okay, now the thalamus is an extremely important organ. I think of the thalamus as just one big relay. Okay, the thalamus is made up of about 23 different nuclei, okay, 23 different centers, okay, that project out to all areas of the cerebral cortex. Okay, and remember I said in the previous video about sensory receptor modalities, remember these receptors, regardless of their type, are generating action potentials to the brain. Okay, how the brain figures out that this is temperature, that this is pain, that this is something mechanical, is where this sensory pathway is going to specifically terminate in the brain. Okay, in the thalamus, this is thermo information coming in, and the thalamus is going to relay this to the proper area of the brain, so I can figure out, okay, well, this is temperature. It's called the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe. All right. So then basically from the spinal cord to the thalamus, that's what we're going to call the second order neuron. This is the second nerve cell that is involved in this pathway of getting sensory input to the brain. Okay. And then the axons that project out from the relay nuclei in the thalamus that go to the cerebral cortex, that's the third order neuron. That's the third nerve that's involved in this process. Okay? And now once we get to the cerebral cortex, this is the perception of the stimulus. Okay? Because remember, your cerebral cortex, that's your conscious perception of the environment. Okay? This is where we consciously realize that there's a stimulus, that there's a temperature difference between my hand and this table, pain, the glasses you put on your face, the perfume or cologne you spray on yourself, all right? You're not going to be able to perceive that until this sensory pathway works its way up to the conscious part of your brain, the cerebral cortex, okay? Everything else below the cerebral cortex, that's all unconscious activity, unconscious reflexes, and communication that is going on within the body. So keep that in mind. Okay? And then this is where the difference comes in with the way some people explain this, is the fourth order neurons. Okay? Not neuron, but neurons. Okay? Because when you look at the cerebral, the layout of the cerebral cortex, okay, and I'm actually going to do a video later in the week about that. The cerebral cortex is, composed of many, many, many interneurons. Okay? And there's a lot of communication going on between areas of the cerebral cortex, the hemispheres, and whatnot. Okay, and basically that's what some people like to say, classifies the fourth order neuron, just the communication between all the neural connections of the cerebral cortex. Okay, but traditionally, it's not incorrect to think this. It's not incorrect to think the third order neuron. I'm just giving you basically both options to think about. Okay, so again. The first nerve that's involved in this pathway is from the sensory receptor to the spinal cord or the brainstem. If we're talking about cranial nerves, okay, they're most of those are just going to go right to the brainstem. Okay, and then the second order neuron would be from the inner neurons in the spinal cord or the brainstem. Okay, projecting to the thalamus. Okay, and then once they reach the thalamus, then other neurons are going to project out from the centers of the thalamus to the cerebral cortex, okay? And then our conscious interpretation of the stimulus, the fourth order neuron is basically what's going on there, all right? So bear in mind, keep in mind about just how all this works, okay? Because, if we get more advanced in the discussion, if you're going to, go into neurology or learn about, more in-depth neuroanatomy, you'll learn exactly where these ascending pathways cross over. And for example, if you damage, and depending on where you damage the nerve, before or after it crossed over, you're going to have problems with, interpreting the stimuli. Okay, but I'm not going to go into that kind of detail. But again, this is the classical pathway of how sensory information gets to the cortex for us to consciously perceive. Remember. That's the key word of that is perception. Okay, we don't perceive a sensory stimulus until it hits the cortex. Okay, a reflex, like a withdrawal reflex, that's an unconscious reaction. Okay, like when you grab a hot object and you twitch away. Okay, you don't know what's going on until that, typically it happens, because of a painful stimulus. Okay, you're not going to know that that's happening until, whatever that stimulus was gets to the cortex. Okay. So keep this in mind. The four order neuron pathway: receptor to spinal cord, spinal cord to thalamus, thalamus to cerebral cortex, and then all the inner workings of the cortex. All the synapses firing to allow us to consciously perceive the stimulus. Okay. So this is basically how, again, we get sensory information from a receptor to the brain. All right.